Now, when Trump was president, remember the Democrats were forever warning us about how his tweets and his statements about hot-button issues affected our standing on the world stage. And then Biden comes along and he promised that not only would he usher in this new era of peace and calm and unity, but that America would once again return to its proper role in the world.
I speak today as President of the United States at the very start of my administration, and I'm sending a clear message to the world. America is back.
But what he really meant is America is back to the 1970s. Well, that's back when the Democrats echoed a similar theme of despair and presided over our decline, and of course left us weaker vis-a-vis our enemies. Back then it was a malaise that Jimmy Carter said was hanging over the United States, but now it's the thick, toxic fog of racism, past, present, and of course future. Well, Biden's climate czar, John Kerry, he's about to show us how easy it is to represent the U.S. over in China when his entire party back home believes we're systemically racist. And I'm not talking about minor figures, but our own UN ambassador, no less.
I've seen for myself how the original sin of slavery weaved white supremacy into our founding documents and principles.
Of course, Biden himself set the grim tone in his inaugural address.
A cry that can't be any more desperate or any more clear. And now, a rise of political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat.
Okay. Why would any country want to take orders from or work with a country where white supremacy is rampant? Add to this the flames of racial hatred fanned by our left-wing media, night after night egging on the radicals on the ground in Minnesota. All of them, the BLM activists, the press, the politicians, Hollywood, they're all culpable here. Because they exercise their power, and some get very rich, as we've learned, by lying to our young kids about our country. They're lying about our history, and they're lying about our founding principles. All of it.
Doubts about whether policing is just irreconcilably broken when it comes to people of color have no choice but to crystallize
in the original sin of this country, which is slavery and racism and Jim Crow. And I think we were basically living, we thought that maybe we were in a post-racial era, and we weren't.
And they don't think for 1 second about how all of this plays right into China's hands. One of Chinese Communist Party's unofficial media outlets, the Global Times, put it bluntly. The U.S. has neither the moral standing nor the real power to issue orders to China over climate issues. And of course, things worked out so well the last time the Biden administration tried to get China to do something.
There are many problems within the United States regarding human rights, which is admitted by the U.S. itself as well, such as Black Lives Matter. It's important that we manage our respective affairs well, instead of deflecting the blame on somebody else in this world.
Well, of course, since then, Secretary Blinken and his foreign policy shop, they've tried desperately to convince the American people, and the rest of the world for that matter, that they do take the CCP challenge seriously. But by now, it's pretty obvious that we cannot persuade other countries to work with the United States unless we're perceived to be as strong and proud of our country as China is of theirs. But of course, Biden officials, with their ongoing defamation of America, are encouraging the riots that hurt our poorest communities back home. They basically admitted the CCP was right about how terrible our country is.
We know we have work to do at home. That includes addressing profound inequities, including systemic racism.
But work with us, because we're good people. As if that wasn't bad enough, Biden's director of national intel, Avril Haines, doesn't even rank China's economic and military aggression as one of our core challenges, if you can believe it. The Wall Street Journal reported that she warned of global disequilibrium that will be fueled by the lingering effects of the pandemic, climate change, environmental degradation, conflict over resources, and refugee crises. In other words, China's just a side note to her. It's the climate, not the country with the massive military and nuclear arsenal that's the real threat, people. And speaking of climate, sending the famously inept John Kerry to woo the Chinese on climate change? That's an embarrassment in the making. Everyone knows that the Chinese Communist Party is not going to play ball on climate unless we pay them. And everyone assumes that Kerry has gone to Shanghai to negotiate the price. The CCP's terms will include the lifting of any tariffs and other anti-China legislation. Of course, also support for the 2022 Winter Olympics and a grab bag of other demands. All of which Kerry is totally prepared for, right?
As the president has said, the climate issue is a freestanding issue. It's not for trade against the other critical differences that we have with China right now.
How do you separate those things? Because our reporting suggests that the Chinese will not separate them.
Well, remains to be seen. We'll figure that out.
Wait a second. That's his strategy. We'll figure it out. Translation. He's winging it. But don't worry. He did such a bang-up job as Obama's Secretary of State. Remember the Iran deal? What could possibly go wrong in Shanghai? And he has all sorts of nifty ideas, by the way, on how to hold China accountable on its climate pledges.
Al Gore and a team of investors and others have been putting together a major capacity digitally from space and elsewhere to be able to measure the footprint all around the planet of what one corporation or one country is doing.
Wait a second. The human dirigible known as Al Gore has some space measurement thing that the... Oh, President Xi really must be trembling, John. Well, Kerry, of course, he's going to assure his Chinese counterparts that he'll fight for concessions back home for the good of the planet in the shared mission. Then he's going to brag on TV here that China is indeed cooperating, everything's under advisement, but that America has to be flexible and open-minded. In other words, Kerry's visit will allow the CCP to boast that no matter how much they humiliate Americans, as they did in Alaska with Blinken, will always come crawling back to beg for their help. This completely undercuts Secretary Blinken's efforts to build cooperation, which he said he was going to do, with other countries against the CCP. But don't worry, this won't be the first time Kerry embarrasses himself and the country on the world stage.
They told the stories of times that they had personally raped, cut off ears, cut off heads, taped wires from portable telephones to human genitals and turned up the power, cut off limbs, blown up bodies, randomly shot at civilians, razed villages in a fashion reminiscent of Genghis Khan.
The Genghis Khan was my favorite. Today's equivalent, of course, is when BLM radicals and activists slander all of law enforcement as racist killers, indiscriminately shooting at minorities across the United States. But that dour, hateful speech all those years ago presaged what would become the defining trait of today's Democrats: their impulse for loathing America instead of loving her. And that's the angle.